This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Ursino. On today's show, we are continuing our A24 Retrospective series. This is the 28th edition of this series. You can listen to recent episodes 274, A24 Retrospective, The End of the Tour, 265, A24 Retrospective, Amy, or go all the way back to 108, A History of A24 Films, to get the full backstory on the company. Today we are looking at the 2015 film Dark Places, directed by Gilles Paquet-Brenner. The film stars Charlize Theron as Libby Day, a woman who, when she was a child, witnessed her entire family being murdered in a satanic ritual by her disturbed older brother. I want to welcome back to the show Matthew Simpson. Matthew is one half of the Awesome Friday podcast and one of the co-founders of the Cascadian Film and Television Critics Association. Matthew was last heard on episode 266, the 2024 Oscar nominations reactions. Welcome back, Matthew. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
It is, yes. I'm glad that we can make this work. Originally, I was maybe going to have someone else, and that person was unavailable. And then you graciously stepped up to the plate in very short notice, in about a week's notice. So I very much appreciate you coming on to talk about this movie.
Yeah, no, of course. I actually really enjoy this series as well. So I'm always happy to be a part of it. How many of these have I done with you now? It's got to be like 3 or 4, right?
I think this might be the third. I can probably figure that out in a little bit once I pull up my spreadsheet. But yeah, off the top of my head, I think this might be the third. Do you know what other ones you've been on?
Yeah, I did The Captive with you and The Rover, and I think that's it. I think this is the third. I think you're right.
Yes, yeah, that's all I'm seeing is those two.
Although it's my 8th or 9th appearance on the show, I think, right? 1, 2.
It is, yes.
4,
You're
6,
more
7,
than overdue from a Better Know a Contributor interview where I ask you some random questions.
Well, I look forward to that. Very much so, actually.
You are definitely next on the list because you definitely have the most amount of appearances without me interviewing you.
Nice. Well, like I say, anytime. I look forward to that very much.
I was 8 the night they were killed. The little orphan girl of the Kansas Prairie Massacre.
It's a real tragedy what happened. And your brother in jail going on 28 years.
If you want to convince me that Ben's innocent, you're wasting your time.
No, you just gotta pick your brain about what happened that day.
Tell me about this club.
We call it the Kill Club. Ex-cops, private investigators. We solve crimes. That's what we do. Go see Ben. It all starts with Ben.
What are you talking about?
Libby, Ben is innocent.
Here comes my little sister after all these years. Go ahead, ask the question.
I don't need to ask. I know you killed them.
No, I did not.
Then why have you never filed for an appeal?
All right. Well, let's get into this movie. Dark Places was directed by Gilles Paquet-Brenner, who is from France. Dark Places was his 9th film, but most of his early films were made back in his home country. He has only made one movie since Dark Places, and that was 2017's Crooked House, an Agatha Christie adaptation. This film stars Charlize Theron as Libby Day, who as a child may or may not have witnessed her entire family get brutally murdered in a satanic ritual by her disturbed brother Ben, played by, as a child, Ty Sheridan. Now as an adult, Libby, still dealing with the trauma, has refused to get steady work and instead relies on donations from people who write her letters telling Libby how bad they feel for her. When the money dries up, she accepts an invitation from Nicholas Holtz Lyle, who runs a true crime murder club. His club also helps solve crimes, and they believe that Ben Day was not the killer, and instead, Libby was coerced to admit that the one surviving member of the family was the killer, and the club wants to free Ben. The film stars Corey Stoll as an adult incarcerated Ben Day, Christina Hendricks as Libby's mother in the flashbacks, Chloe Grace Moretz as Deandra, Ben's pregnant teen girlfriend, and Sean Bridgers as the family's estranged father and potential suspect. The movie was adapted from a Gillian Flynn novel in the same name, released in 2009. Dark Places was released a year after the success of Flynn's other adaptation, 2014's Gone Girl, directed by David Fincher. The film had its distribution rights purchased by A24 in November 2014, with the film being released first in France in April 2015, with the film then going to DirecTV in June and a limited US theatrical release in August of the same year. This is going to be a spoiler-filled episode, so if you have not watched the film, we suggest doing so first. As mentioned, this movie came on the heels of the success of Gone Girl and is actually in development to be remade as an HBO series. When the film came out, it was eviscerated by critics, where it holds a 23% critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 39% on Metacritic. Using the power of hindsight and seeing more adaptations of Flynn's work, was this movie unfairly maligned, or does its reputation of a forgettable stinker hold up, Matthew?
Oh, no, it holds up. I mean, I don't like trashy movies as a rule, and I wouldn't say that this movie is like egregiously bad. It's just mostly boring and forgettable. Like, I watched this movie the night before last, and I'm struggling to remember aspects of it already. I was trying to remember something about a scene that I wanted to talk about, and I just can't remember the details. I had to Google it. And it's only 2 days ago. Like, it's not even 2 days ago, and that's sort of, I think, how it's just not very good. It's just boring. It's just boring. It's not equal, not even equal to the sum of its parts. I don't quite. It would almost be fascinating if it wasn't so boring.
Would you say this movie is potentially A24's most forgotten or overlooked movie, in the sense of, people talk about movies from the A24 canon of, either their favorites or the most underrated or hidden gems or whatever, adjective you want to use to describe movies, or most disliked. And I feel like I quite literally had never heard of this movie before in my life, and every time I was going through my calendar of what episodes were coming up, I kept being like, which one is Dark Places again? Which one is this again? There's a couple more coming up in the next, we're in the 2015s. In the 2015, 2016, there's a couple more that I'm like, I literally have never heard of this movie. But this might be the ultimate, what is this movie for me?
I mean, yeah, I remember when it came out, because when I went to watch this movie, I asked my wife, who also watches a ton of movies, I'm like, you've seen this, right? Because it was on TV at one point. And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, I'm going to talk about it on a podcast. She's like, why? It's so boring. And I think, yeah, it probably had the most limited release of any A24 I can think of off the top of my head. Probably, at least in part, because I think they only distributed it rather than producing it, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And I don't know what caused it, but yeah, this film, did it even, I think you probably just said, but did it even get a theatrical release? Like, I don't remember it being in cinemas at all.
It did supposedly get a limited release. I don't know how many theaters it was released to, but it could very well be one of those things where it's like, oh, it was in New York and LA for 2 weeks and that was it.
Yeah, and I remember seeing it when it showed up on Netflix at one point, which was probably like 2017 or 2018, and being like, Charlize Theron, like Gillian Flynn adaptation, oh, Rotten Tomatoes score. And then and I do actually remember coming home from work, with the day job one day, to find my wife watching it and not joining her because she was more than halfway in. And I was like, oh, what is this movie with? Oh, it's that movie I remember from 2 years ago. And then I forgot about it until you mentioned it again. So I think forgettable is probably the word that applies most to this movie.
I'm very surprised how its reputation has not stuck to literally anyone involved into this movie. Gillian Flynn still getting her works adapted. After this was done, she helped co-write an original story for Steve McQueen in Widows. She executive produced Sharp Objects, and the fact that they're remaking this, and I was reading I think it was the Deadline release when I saw that this was being remade, which I couldn't even find. I had to dig several layers deep into Wikipedia before I saw a mention of it, and I'm reading the release, and then at the very bottom it was like, oh yes, and back in 2015 this movie was made with Charlize Theron. It's like, oh, wow, okay, everyone is just going to glaze completely over this movie. But Gillian Flynn has not had any sort of adverse reaction to this being in her filmography or adaptations. Charlize Theron, it's considered an afternote. No one talks about her being in this. Every other actor in it, where I think it's got a pretty stacked cast of good character actors. Ty Sheridan, for a couple of years, I thought was going to be a huge breakout star, and he was in a couple mainstream movies, and then I don't know if he's fizzled out or what's happening, but I've always liked Ty Sheridan as an actor. Christina Hendricks is someone who I think is a good actor, but needs the right part to showcase her talents. Nicholas Hoult is a star now. All these sort of people are in it, and none of the stench kind of sticks with them.
I mean, I think this comes back to the fact that I think forgotten, unmemorable is probably the kindest thing I can say about this movie. I think in order for this sort of, the stench to stick, people would have to remember that it exists, and nobody does. And I do kind of wonder why it got such a limited release. I wonder if they watched it and they were like, oh, Jesus, like, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
And again, like, you're not wrong. Like, I actually think Charlize Theron is pretty good in this movie. And Nicholas Hoult is totally fine. And I actually think Corey Stoll is great. I think he's always great. But I thought he was pretty great as the brother. I thought that I find Ty Sheridan really interesting, too, because he, like, for a while there, he was like Ready Player One and in the X-Men movies. But most of the stuff he's been really good in has been, like, really interesting indie choices. And he's really only been in like one or maybe two things since 2021, I think. So maybe he's on some kind of like career break, or maybe he's just producing a bunch of stuff, but he's an interesting performer. You're not wrong. And then like Drea De Matteo shows up, and she's like exactly right for the sort of trashy person she's playing. I think Christina Hendricks is fine. Chloe Grace Moretz is in this, and if anyone was going to have, like, if this was going to be a black mark on anyone's filmography, I think it might be hers, because I think I don't want to go so far as to say that she's bad, but I think she's woefully miscast. Like, I don't think she fits the role very well.
Yeah. She's someone I definitely want to spend some time talking about in a bit.
Yeah, and I don't like. I find it hard because, like, I think she probably did everything she could, and people get locked into contracts or whatever. But I just don't think she was right for it. Like, I think that her whole vibe does not mesh with what this movie is trying to do with her character, and I imagine she was trying to like do something maybe a little bit different, but it doesn't work. It just doesn't. But she's the only one. Like, she's the only one in this movie who I'd be like, oh yeah, maybe she wants to forget it. But it's such a weird misfire. I don't get it. I don't get it at all.
So now you already know this, but dear listeners, I actually really like this movie. I had never, as I said before, I had never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. I watched this movie, and all I knew going into it was I don't try to do much research when I'm about to watch a movie for the podcast where I know nothing about. I'll kind of just look up a little bit, be like, okay, what's this? What I'm sort of expecting genre-wise, so I have a bit of an idea of what I'm going into, because it's good to go in without preconceived notions, but if you know you're going into a mystery thriller movie, there are things you're going to want to look for to see if it's communicating that genre correctly. So that was kind of the amount of information I had gone in, where I didn't even fully read the IMDb log line. It was just very much like, oh, it's a murder mystery, Charlize Theron's in it. That's all I kind of know about it. I was like, okay, cool, that's all I need to know. And so I went in knowing that it's got a horrible reputation, and seeing, the letterbox few reviews that I sort of very quickly scrolled past was all like, this is awful, this is god awful, 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 awful. And it was starting, and I was like, okay, this is going to be a bad movie, let's go into it. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised that as it was going on, I was finding myself quite invested in this story. And at first I was like, oh, Charlize Theron's so unlikable. But then I sort of appreciated her unlikableness due to the fact that I believe she was actually playing the character as intended, where this is a woman riddled with trauma and guilt, survivor's guilt, and she doesn't know how to function in the real world. And like by the time the second or third scene with her happened, I was like, no, you know what? I get her character and I understand what she's doing, and I'm sort of on her same wavelength. And yeah, Nicholas Holt's character is a weirdo for wanting to approach her to tell her life story at a murder club, and that's very weird, and he doesn't really have a personal space boundaries and things like that. And so I found myself very quickly on the wavelength of the movie. Now, that said, we're going to get into some stuff that absolutely did not work, but overall, I was perfectly fine with this movie, and I would say I mildly liked it. And I know that that's going to, I feel like there's going to be times throughout our conversation today where I'm going to be defending it a little bit. And it's going to be a very mild defense for the sake of conversation, not a full-throated defense of, no, Matthew, you're absolutely wrong, and this is a misunderstood masterpiece.
I mean, it's definitely not that. Like, I mean, honestly, all the pieces are there. It's interesting to me that it doesn't work, because literally all the pieces are there. And I think it's just that, like, in a few places it either goes too far or doesn't go far enough in what it's trying to do. And it just ends up being, for me, again, like I think I said already, that like it ends up being like not even equal to the sum of its parts. And it's interesting, and it would be more interesting if it wasn't. So again, I just found it really forgettable. But hey, man, taste is taste. If you like it, I'm happy for you. I'm glad it works for you.
Thank you. Yes, team, see it for yourself, as you always say.
Absolutely. Every piece of art is somebody's jam, even if it's not mine, right? So maybe this one is yours. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. With that.
I want to talk a little bit about the non-linear structure. And this isn't, non-linear in the sense of a Christopher Nolan movie where we're jumping in the past, then we're jumping in the future, and then the present, and you never know what timeline you're in. This is, two concurrent timelines going, basically. You've got this, the present day where Libby is being hired by Nicholas Holt's character, Lyle, to help investigate whether or not Libby's brother actually was the murderer. And then you kind of have mostly linear backstory of the night of the murder and sort of leading up to the murder. Now, there is a little bit of jumping around, especially towards the end when we're getting the reveal of, who really was the killer, whether it was the brother or not. We do go back a bit further before the murders happen, but for the most part, it's a pretty, standard two timelines going on concurrently at the same time. Did you have any questions about the way that they chose to deliver these two storylines, or did it work, from a structural standpoint for you?
No, I mean, I wouldn't even go so far as to say that it's like non-linear. It's just two concurrent linear timelines. And there's a little bit of backpedaling towards the end, like you said, just to like make the reveal of who's doing what in the mystery work. But that's pretty standard. Like it's what you might call even bog standard. Like it's just like it's almost too by the numbers in that way. Like, oh, in the present, someone's investigating something from their past that they are obviously misremembering, and then at the very end, it shows what they remember, and then it also shows what really happened, and it's just not interesting. Just gonna keep saying stuff like that. But it's like it's almost like, again, I think I said before that like in certain places it goes too far with the thing it's trying to do, and in other places it's just not very creative or doesn't go far enough. And this is one of those places where maybe a little less linearity or a little more jumping around anyway would be better. Or maybe if they had taken the time to sort of show what Libby remembers, and then to like as she is being investigating her own past, having her like memories sort of contrasted with what actually happened in those moments, might have been more interesting. Something a little more creative is what I'm looking for here. Because again, this is just very straightforward.
Yeah, I wonder if a big plot point for this movie is Libby was the only person to give testimony against her brother because she was the only other surviving family member. And she was 8 years old when these murders happened. And we get, a scene at the beginning where you have, I'm guessing, a police officer or something being like, Libby, was Ben the one that did this? Did he kill your family? And she never really responds. And then we get a second scene later on in the movie where she's testifying, and it's still a very sort of similar, she isn't really giving concrete answers. And I almost appreciate that the movie, they could have very much gone into the fact of like, oh, it's very easy to coerce testimony, especially from, a child who may or may not remember exactly, and the police believe this is exactly what happened based on evidence, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff, that they didn't lean into the trope of police coercing testimony out of someone, being like, if you don't testify against your brother, he might come back and hurt you or something like that, where I feel like they really could have overdone that aspect of trying to convince Libby to testify. And so I sort of appreciate that it's on the viewer to understand what she was going through. And it's fine. I'm going to be saying a bunch of these things, and you're probably going to disagree with me. But I appreciated that aspect.
I mean, so again, I think you're not wrong, and I think that's actually really well-intentioned. I also think that it would have been way more interesting to dive into, again, like that first scene where the cop is basically telling her, like, he's not asking her, he's telling her that, like, yes, oh, your brother killed these people, your brother killed your family. And then it does absolutely nothing with that. Like, you're not wrong that it does leave it on the viewer a little bit to be like, oh, the police are bad. All cops are bad. But also, it does nothing with that moving forward. It never, like, really has her grapple with maybe the guilt of being like, oh, I was coerced as a child. It doesn't ever do it. It leaves it up to the viewer, but it also does nothing with it at all, which I think is a bit of a failing.
I think I agree with you on text on the page. It does not do anything with it, but I think Charlize Theron communicates that well enough where when Lyle is being like, no, you gotta go talk to your brother. You gotta talk to your brother, and she's like, I haven't talked to my brother since the murders happened. I'm not talking to my brother. And eventually, she does get convinced to go see him in prison, and that's kind of like a fine, I'll do it just because you're paying me sort of deal. And the couple times that she visits him, I think every time she sort of starts to let her guard down a little bit, as I think she's coming to terms with understanding the position that she might have been put into, and especially, what the group, this murder club, is sort of telling her, being like, no, I think your brother is innocent. I don't think he actually did it. And she's like, well, I saw him, I testify. And then they're like, yeah, but did you really? Did you actually see him commit the murders? And so textually, that's not there. Subtextually, I believe it's there in Theron's performance. That said, I think it was a lot of very subtle work, and that's something I sort of appreciate it from her performance, where she wasn't really telegraphing the over-the-top missing text and bringing it as subtext. So that was something I sort of really appreciated from her performance, and I can easily see where maybe that's me filling in the gaps a little bit of being like, yeah, all cops are bad. Yes, they coerce the testimony. Oh, she's feeling guilty. Maybe that's me sort of filling in the blanks of how I'm projecting the movie should go. But I thought that Theron did a more than adequate job of sort of connecting those dots without explicitly saying it to me.
So that means Charlize Theron is a great actor. And I think she's good in this movie, and I think she brings as much depth as she possibly can to this character. And I also think you're reading a lot into it. I mean, like, I could definitely see her thought process. Like, maybe that is what she was thinking, and maybe she's trying to, like, communicate that depth you're talking about. I don't think it was there substantially enough to say that it's actually there, personally.
Okay.
And again, it's just one of those things where if they had done anything with that idea a little more substantially, it would be a better movie, I think.
That's fair. Okay.
I think it's just like the whole problem with this movie is that it's just sort of except for the few moments where it's really overcommitted, it's really undercommitted to doing anything creative or interesting with all of these great seeds. Like there's so many good ideas that are like left on the page, and I find it is really interesting. It would be more interesting
Yeah.
if the movie was better, but or honestly, it'd be way more interesting if the movie was a lot worse.
You're right. Yes.
But it's just kind of fine and boring. And anyway, yeah, I feel like I'm repeating myself, so I'm going to stop there.
Well, let's sort of talk about where maybe the movie could have got substantially worse. And this movie, I say in the description, the I don't know if the inspiration, but the killings were supposedly done in a satanic ritual, and so the early timeline of the movie takes place, I'm guessing, in the early 80s. Does it say a year? I don't think it does.
Yeah, it does. It's 1985.
Oh, 1985. Okay.
Yeah, I did write that down.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This era is like right in the middle of the throes of the satanic panic. And I think for the most part, this movie captures the mood. And I think it is a tricky thing to recreate today because it was just so insane of an era. Now, you're a little bit older than I am, so I wasn't really a lot. I wasn't, I was born in 89, so I don't really know what it was like in the 80s. But I do remember in the 90s, these crusades of all these different music and pop culture things that were happening in the early to mid 90s of being like, no, this is, satanic, or this will turn your kids into devil worshippers and all this sort of stuff. And I know that's just a continuation from what was going on in the 80s. And so I sort of appreciate there's, a couple scenes where they're asking children if they were, being molested or sexually assaulted by older children or adults and things like that. And that's sort of recreating the exact events that were happening, where there was that primary school where, something like 100 kids all said that they were, molested in a satanic ritual. And so the owners went to jail for like 20 years. And then they realized, oh, never mind, this was all forced testimony. And the kids were just going along with what they thought they were having a fun time and all that sort of stuff. So I thought that they captured that era correctly. Now, whether or not it looks good on screen is a completely different thing, because it's so unbelievable and ridiculous, and it looks so overacted. Yet I also imagine that's kind of what it was like a little bit. So it's a section of the film that I sort of struggle with appreciating, because like I said, I think it's period accurate, and I also think it's so over the top and ridiculous, where I think if the movie sort of leaned into that aspect a bit more, it would have been a hell of a lot of a worse movie that you were sort of talking about, where it could have very easily gone down a different path. What were your sort of thoughts on the satanic aspects being depicted?
So, I mean, I was a child when that was all happening. Like, I'm older than you, but I'm not that much.
I know you're not much older. Yes.
So like in 85, I was 4. So like I was alive, but I didn't like live through it. You know what I mean? And I would say that the film does a really good job, at least a good job, of capturing that sort of like, oh, kids are all into Satan, in that really like slow pre-social media, peak traditional news cycle kind of way, where it's all kind of like, oh, the kids are into Satan. And that's really scary. But I think it needed to go. There's one scene in this movie where there's, I don't know if we want to spoil it at this point, but there's one scene in this movie that involves Ty Sheridan and Chloe Grace Moretz and a third actor whose name escapes me off the top of my head. That is so over the top that I feel like the rest of the film either needed to be toned down, or the rest of the film needed to match it. And I don't know if that would have made it good, but it would have made it interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that scene, because that's sort of, the next place I want to go with it. And the third actor, his name is Shannon Kook, or he also goes by Shannon Kook Chun. And the reason why I know that so specifically is because he's a Toronto actor, and a former friend of mine had a brief fling with him. And I just find it hilarious that he is cast as an Indigenous person, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure he's he's Vietnamese or something like that. I can't remember exactly what his ethnicity is. And they sort of make a joke about it when he's young, where they can't tell what race he is. And then when he's older, he's like, nope, I'm an indigenous man. I'm a native man. And it's just like, okay, they have no idea who this character is, which I thought was a little hilarious.
I'm just looking him up, and it's fascinating because he is, his full name is Shannon Xiaolong Kukchun, and he is South African of Chinese and Cape color. He is as far away from indigenous North American as you can probably get.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Like, that is, wow.
Yeah. He definitely has a, I think some of his photos, he probably has a bit of a ethnically ambiguous look, being South African and Chinese. Probably will do that to
I mean, if he'd come
yourself
up like 20 years ago, like Cliff Curtis did, who is very famously, of Maori descent and has played every non-white ethnicity there is, he might have had a shot at doing that. But I think we're sort of past that era of filmmaking, and it's really interesting that I didn't know that he's not indigenous North American at all.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of at the very tail end of this era of Hollywood casting where it's like, you're not white, you could be any race you want, sort of thing. Where a couple of years after this movie comes out, it's very much like, maybe we should stop doing that.
Yeah, and that was the right call. Yeah.
But let's talk about that scene in particular. And that scene in particular is where you've got young Deandra, played by Chloe Grace Moretz, and young Trey, who is Shannon Kook, where they are basically bringing Ben into the actual satanic cult. So it goes from, things like, Ben molested me because and told me that as he was doing it, I had to say "Hail Satan," and sort of this like BS that was going on at the time, where Satanism wasn't really a thing. You had Anton LaVey on TV being like, "Yes, Satanism is real," but in reality, it wasn't really real in like widespread Middle America. And then they insert this scene of, actually, no, it is real. These kids actually are into Satanism. And so they go to a farm, and this is kind of probably one of the few times I think there actually needs to be a bit of a real trigger warning for a movie, because it's pretty gross. They are going to kill a bunch of cows as a sacrifice for Satan, and they're bringing Ben along, and this is sort of his indoctrination fully into Satanism. And he's standing there watching as they are literally using axes and knives to kill several cows in a row. And they're like, what are you going to do? You got to come join us. You got to be a part of this. Bring it out. And he eventually does kill some cows with them. But it is, probably the most disturbing scene in the movie, but also the most over-the-top, ridiculous, hilarious, nonsensical scene that just sticks so far out from the rest of the movie, where I think, maybe in 5 years, if we were to talk about this movie, you're like, hey, remember that time we did that podcast about Dark Places? And you'll be like, was that the movie where they sacrifice a bunch of cows? And I'll be like, yeah, that's the movie.
Yeah, it's a movie where, like, Chloe Grace Moretz with, like, admittedly, a very disturbing, like, anger in her eyes, looks right at the camera and says, "Come get your kill, baby," whilst covered in cow blood. Like, that is the most memorable thing in this whole movie, as far as I'm concerned. And you're right. It sticks out because it is so far over the top and so out of place compared to the rest of the tone and pace and the structure of the movie. But it is at least memorable.
And I think it sort of adds up where, unfortunately, Chloe Grace Moretz is, every scene she is in, it is the worst scene in the movie. And this is the top of the iceberg of, this is the worst scene of the movie. But every other scene she's in, she just seems, I don't know if she is miscast, misdirected, not bringing the right emotional level to it, or the part is not written correctly, because I can believe if you tell me any aspect of it is why her scenes don't work, I would believe you. If they're like, this is the way her dialogue was written and it's bad dialogue, I would say, yes, that makes sense. If it's like, no, the director told her to go over the top and, you know, she's the Satanist, yeah, that makes sense. She brings that. If Chloe Grace Moretz, who we've seen in other things, who I think, I don't know if she's a good actor or not. She's been good in other projects and I like her in other things, but I don't consistently like her. So is it just she's miscast or she's not the right actor or not strong enough for this role? Maybe. I don't know what the answer is, but whatever it is, it's probably a combination of all those things. She does not work in this movie.
I'm just going to leave it that she's miscast, that she's the wrong choice. Because I think she is a pretty strong actor. I think films like, I mean, obviously Kick-Ass, but even more recently, well, I say recently, but this is like 10 years ago, Clouds of Sils Maria, she's great. She's good in The Equalizer, which is a role that requires her to be a little different than her sort of prior persona. I think she's actually really good in the Suspiria sequel remake thing that Luca Guadagnino did. I haven't seen it, but everyone tells me she's great in Shadow in the Cloud. So I think that, like, I think she's not a bad actor. I think she's just wrong for this part. And I think that, like, I think it's also fair to say her character's not very well written because, again, I don't think this whole movie is very well written. So, at least dialogue wise. So, I don't know. I just think it's a part of I think the film as a whole doesn't really work. And I think that her part in it is the part that doesn't work the most. But I don't really think it's her fault either.
Yeah, I agree with you on that aspect. And then when we eventually meet the adult Deandra, at first I was like, oh, I don't like this actor either. She's played by Andrea Roth. And then I sort of was remembering and be like, oh no, that's because Chloe Grace Moretz was playing her as absolutely psychotic. Yeah, it makes sense that the adult version is also kind of psychotic as well too. I know I said this is sort of a spoiler-filled episode, and we're going to talk a little bit about. I'm not going to spoil everything about this movie, but I will say it kind of caught me a bit by surprise of what the adult Deandra, her character, had to do with the story. I will also say that I think it was also a bit shoehorned in the way that the movie was written, of the reveal of her involvement or lack thereof. I'm really dancing around the ending here right now.
I mean, a little bit, yeah. So this sort of comes around to something I kind of wanted to talk about in terms of the film not really working, in that, to me, so this film came out in 2015. The book was written in 2009.
Yeah.
And the story is set in, quote, 1985 and the present. And so even in 2009, that means that, 24 years would have gone by, assuming we just assume that it's a straight timeline, right? And I think that the people playing older versions of the younger characters generally don't match up.
Yeah.
I think they're all too old. And that is exemplified by a character. I mean, how much spoilers? I'm about to spoil a reveal of a character towards the end. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
So it's revealed that Deandra has a daughter, and it's Ben's. And in 2015, so in the early part of the film, Chloe Grace Moretz's character is pregnant, and so in the present, there's a daughter, and which is a spoiler, but also, like, it is not a spoiler. Like, that's going to happen from, like, minute one. However, that character is presented as being, like, an older teenager, or, like, maybe in their early 20s, and they are played by someone who is almost as old as I am. And I just feel like there's no consistency in the casting from the younger actors to the older actors, and there's no clear timeline on what the present actually is. And so everyone feels at least a little bit too old for the person they're supposed to be playing. You know, like the person who's supposed to be 20 looks 30, and the person who is supposed to be like 40 looks 35. And it's so weird and wildly inconsistent. And I feel like nobody like looked at all the actors and went like, we need to establish like a baseline of what the aging is happening here. And they just didn't do that. And it takes me out of the movie, actually. Especially towards the end when that character's introduced. And they're like, hi, she's like, hi, I'm a young girl. I'm the secret daughter. And I'm like, you are a fully fledged person. You are an adult. You're a fully developed frontal lobe. Like, you are in your 30s, and they are presenting you like you're in your late teens, and it does not work. And I don't quite get how that happened. And again, I think it's just that, like, it doesn't seem like there was a lot of thought put into this. I don't know. Did you find that at all? Like, that was something that really kicked me out of the movie towards the end.
I forgot what year this movie was supposed to be taking place, and like I knew it was mid 80s, the flashback stuff, but I didn't know what the present day was. And yeah, because that's like a 30-year gap, and it sort of seems that some people aged a lot and some people didn't age very much, and it is definitely not consistent enough across the board. It wasn't really enough to bother me. You know, now that you're sort of talking about the daughter's age and things like that, you know, it would make sense where if this was supposed to take place in 2015, which based on the technology, the fact that they're all using, you know, I hate the term, but dumb phones, where basically just like Charlize Theron is using like a Nokia brick phone. If they said this movie was 2009, that would be more believable. But if this was 2015, iPhones were out by that point, and no one is seen using, you know, early smartphones at this era. So I have a feeling this is supposed to take place in 2009. Either way, that's, you know, I mean, 25 years.
I was going to say, for me, it almost feels like it's meant to take place in 2005, like just a straight 20 years after the 1980s. But then again, like, Corey Stoll looks way too old. And the woman playing the daughter, way too old. And the woman playing older Deandra, way too old. And the guy who plays the older, I forgot the character's name off the top of my head. Jay LaRose plays the older version of Shannon Kook's character, and he looks like he could be Charlize Theron's dad. But they are meant to be, like, of an age together. You know, it's... like, there is no consistency here. And I feel like they needed to maybe think about that a little more.
I think it's one of those things where if the movie didn't work for you, this is really going to bother you. And if the movie worked for you, it's going to be a minor annoyance at best, but for the most part, you can get over. There are some of these characters is pretty egregious, but for the most part, it doesn't bother me as much. And I think it's because I'm more forgiving of the movie overall.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably very true. But for me, like, it was just maybe the reveal of that actor playing this, like, who's clearly like 30, like at least 30, playing this character who's supposed to be 20, was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Because I was like, she walks in and like, again, she has this like affectation where she's like, I'm the secret daughter, you know, I'm like, nope, you are a woman. You are not a child. You are pretending you're a child, but you are a woman. And that is weird and doesn't work. And I think it very well may have been the thing that like pushed me over the edge.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. You mentioned Corey Stoll there. I kind of want to talk a bit about him because I agree he was probably the most exciting part of the movie for me, where I could not get a read on his character the whole time, and I mean that in a positive way. So right away, we're told that he's the killer, and he's been in jail all this time, and we meet him, and he sort of does this sort of, like, born-again shtick, where he's like, oh, you know, I've got my high school diploma, I'm working on getting my my college degree, all this sort of stuff. I read Shakespeare, look at my Shakespeare tattoos. But, like, he's still a little unnerving, and you're just like, okay, that's good for you that you're you're reading books and stuff, but like I still don't trust you. And then the more we learn from him, I think he does a really great job at showing that he has a secret to hide, but without telegraphing too much that, he's hiding something deep inside that will irreparably change everyone's future and outcome based on the secret he knows, which I thought he does a very good job of sort of showcasing that. And Corey Stoll was someone who I think I first saw in House of Cards and right away was like, ooh, I like this actor. And every time he's popped up in something, I've always really enjoyed him. The one time, probably not so much as the first Ant-Man movie, where I think that was sort of a function of the character being written, not a fault of Corey Stoll. But overall, I always appreciate when he pops up in something, and this was no exception.
I mean, Corey Stoll is an exciting actor. For me, the first thing I distinctly remember seeing him in is a movie from 2006 called Lucky Number 11. He plays he's just a henchman in that movie. He's not like a main character. But then he plays, he's been in a bunch of stuff in the middle of this, but then the movie that I remember him most from, which is, it's difficult to talk about now because it's a Woody Allen movie, but he played Ernest Hemingway in Midnight in Paris. And that was the movie where I was like, okay, I'm going to watch anything Corey Stoll is in from now on. Because he is so good in that movie. It's a little bit upsetting. I haven't been able to rewatch it in quite a while because of the whole, it's Woody Allen thing. But he is so good in that movie. And that was the one for me where I was like, yeah, I'm going to watch anything he's going to be in. He's very good in this. I think you're right. I think that he does a really good job of, it's not exactly dancing around that he has a secret, but like very much like his body language, his tone, and the things that the dialogue that he has to give is very good at being like communicating that he's like, I know she's going to get there at some point and I can't give it to her. You know what I mean? Like,
yes. Yeah.
He's very good. He's very good at that. And I think his character is probably the best written character in the whole story. To the point where I just wish he was the protagonist.
He also has this weight of someone who is happy and content with the decisions that they have made in their life, that he knows that he's messed up, but he's also aware that he's accepted any consequences for things he did and did not do. And I think he telegraphs that very well of someone who's like, yeah, I made my mistakes. I've come to terms with them. Have you come to terms with your mistakes yet?
Mm-hmm. And even just like, again, minor spoiler alerts, but like, accepting consequences that aren't necessarily for him for good reasons, and being content with that. Yeah, I think he's probably the best part of the movie for me.
Yeah.
And I almost wish he was the main character. Like I almost wish the movie was Ben in jail and people coming to talk to him. Might have been again a more interesting film.
Yeah, fair enough. What did you think of Charlize Theron as playing, a very unlikable female protagonist, which is sort of Gillian Flynn's hallmark? Obviously the number one that you can go to is in Gone Girl. The performance there is sort of very similar to what Charlize Theron is doing here, as is like, we're not meant to like her from the get-go. It's going to take a while to understand who she is. And I think in the end, Libby Day is a far more likable character than what's her name in Rosamund Pike's character in Gone Girl? Amy Dunn.
Amy Dunn, yeah.
Who the longer Gone Girl goes on, the less you like her.
Well, I mean, Amy Dunn is a sociopath, whereas Libby Day is just a damaged person. Like those are two different things. In the same way where, I don't know if you saw or have read Sharp Objects, but the main character in that is also a very damaged person. And I think that's sort of, again, you're not wrong that it's Gillian Flynn's sort of hallmark. But to answer your question, I thought she was fine. And it's,
Okay.
Charlize Theron is always fine. No, her baseline is fine because she's so good. I can't recall a movie where I have seen Charlize Theron and thought, oh, she was bad. I don't know. So yeah, she's fine. She's totally fine.
Okay.
She's able to, affect the damaged, aloof, fuck this world type characterization that she needs to. And again, I think it needed to go either much further or in a different direction to be more interesting, but it's fine. She's totally fine.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, let me see. Oh yeah, one thing I really want to point out is that I didn't quite care for this movie is the very active camera, where it seems like Gilles Paquet-Brenner could not just let the camera just sit there and photograph a scene or, dolly around ever so slightly. There was almost in every single scene, there are some very intense, punch zooms or crazy whip pans or something that's going on that I'm just like, okay, whoever the DOP is, I don't know if it was your idea or the director's idea, but you all need to just settle down and just film the scene. And it was something that every time it happened, I made a note of it. And I really hate when you can make a note of camera movements. There's times when you watch a movie and when a scene ends, you're like, wow, did the camera do what I think it just did? That was really impressive. In times like that where you're like rewind and you want to rewatch it again, I appreciate that. But most of the time, you don't really want to be thinking of the camera while you're watching a movie. And this is one of those instances where every scene I was thinking about the camera. Was that something that you noticed as well?
I did. I actually went looking as to why, and I wonder how much it is because the cinematographer, it's a guy named Barry Ackroyd, and he has worked a lot with Paul Greengrass, who is sort of notorious for that kind of
Yes.
photography. And I kind of wonder if he just maybe like that's what he does now, because like he shot like Green Zone and Captain Phillips and Jason Bourne.
Hurt Locker.
He also did The Hurt Locker and Detroit. And those are all movies with very like handheld, shaky, active cameras. But he also did like Outlaw King, which I would say the cinematography of which is one of that movie's strongest aspects. And more recently, he did The Old Guard, which is a movie from 2020 that I actually really loved. And I think those movies also have an active cinematography about them, but they make better use, I think, of like sort of more steady tracking shots as opposed to the sort of more frantic thing that you're talking about. And again, I think that it's just another example of a thing that's sort of just out of place, right? Like if the movie is too low key for such an active camera, it doesn't fit. And it's just one of those things that makes the makes the X factor for this movie like either at least not a whole number, like I said this in, I think I wrote about it on Letterboxd, and the way I describe movies in my head is that it's always like the basic equation is like the cast plus the crew and then multiplied by the X factor. And then a lot of the time the X factor is just one. The movie's the sum of its parts, it's fine. Sometimes you get a higher than one number, and that is what makes a great movie. That's when a movie is more than the sum of its parts. And this movie, the number is like 0.5. It's not negative, but there's enough there that it just does not equal the sum of its parts. And I think that's because those parts are often, like in this case, a little bit discordant with one another, and it doesn't really work. And if it had been more over the top with anything, it would at least be more interesting.
Yeah. Looking at Barry Ackroyd's filmography, I understand exactly now what happened, where he shows up where it's like, this is my style, this is my resume. If you want to hire me, this is what you're getting. And they looked at it and goes, yep, this is fine with us. And you're right, it just absolutely does not work for this movie that, for the most part, is trying to be a fairly quiet film. A a mystery that's more about, slowly teasing out details. And most of his filmography is about big movies with big sequences and lots of emotion and things like that. And those, they worked for most of the movies. Like, he shot The Big Short, one of my favorite movies of the last decade, probably, maybe a top 20 film all time for me. And that has an incredibly active camera. And it's because it's going for this, docu-realism style where everything is punctuated by new and groundbreaking information. And it works for that. And it doesn't work for this, where he literally shot them back to back. And I can't think of two more different movies in terms of appropriateness of camera.
Yeah, and I mean, some of this is to do with Gilles Paquet-Brenner as well. Like, you hire the guy, but you also need to, like, tell the guy what to do a little bit. And I feel like there's, again, it's just a little discordant. It doesn't really work. Even though this guy has made a lot of movies that I like, Barry Ackroyd, I mean, he's shot a lot of movies that I like. And Captain Phillips, which was one of the films he did right before Dark Places, is, I think, an excellent use of this kind of active camera. Being mostly set on ships at sea, and they really give you the feeling of those ships like rolling on the sea. It's really, really effective in that movie. Which I think is also just a really underrated movie, just generally speaking. But yeah, it doesn't work here, is the short version of the story.
I have to wonder, why was Gilles Paquet-Brenner chosen to direct this movie? This came a year after Gone Girl, as I've said a few times now, and Gone Girl was such a smash hit. It was nominated for multiple Oscars. It's considered one of David Fincher's best films. You've got all this crazy Hollywood talent and, notable people behind the scenes working on this. And then they decide, oh, what else has Gillian Flynn written? Ooh, her second book was Gone Girl. Let's look at her first book, Dark Places. Let's make that into a movie. Why was that chosen for a director who basically has not worked in the American Hollywood system at all? I think he had like one English movie before this, but it was nothing noteworthy. And he was chosen to do this, and A24 manages to buy the rights for this at a time when they hadn't had a hit. They had a few, quote unquote indie hits, but they hadn't really had their huge breakout moment yet. And so I'm very surprised why Paquet-Brenner was chosen to direct, why A24 was able to get the rights to this movie, all this sort of stuff. I'm sort of baffled by when they clearly are trying to capitalize on the success of Gone Girl, when I didn't even know this movie existed. I didn't realize that Gillian Flynn had an earlier book that was adapted. And so all this is very surprising for me, and I wonder what went wrong in the pre-production aspect that it got to the place where it did to become the movie it eventually became.
So I don't have any inside baseball on this at all. I actually went looking for a bit of the production notes, but a lot of it is very sparse. But honestly, my impression is just that, like, Gone Girl was a huge hit, and they were like, shit, let's get another Gillian Flynn book into production. And who's available? Oh yeah, like Charlize Theron, she wants to do this. Let's do that. Let's build a cast around her. And then, like, just find whoever's available. Oh, this Gilles Paquet-Brenner guy, he wants to break into English. Yeah, let's give him a shot on this movie. Like, the whole thing feels a bit rushed, is what I'm trying to say. Like, rushed into production, rushed through production. And I feel like, I don't want to say that it's thoughtless. Like, no art like this is totally thoughtless, but it does feel like they were, like, in a hurry to get it done. And it suffered as a result. And I don't even want to say 100% that it's his fault, although ultimately, the director is responsible for the film. But it does feel like they were like, you want to come work in America? Great. Let's make this movie, get it done. Can you get it done? And they just cranked it out in a less thoughtful way than other films than it should have been, let's say. Because the other two adaptations of Gillian Flynn's work are both great. So that alone makes this movie disappointing to me.
It really feels like it was something that was rushed in production after the success of Gone Girl, because while movies don't take a year to shoot, they typically take about a year or more to go from pre-production to production to post-production to release. And the fact that they were able to get this done and in theaters less than a year after Gone Girl was released really sort of screams to me that this was a movie that was rushed in every step of the way, where maybe if they spent a bit more time, pre-production trying to work out any issues in the script to approve it, or, waiting until the right director was available to direct this movie, or things like that. I think Charlize Theron is perfectly fine as the lead. I do like her in this movie, so I don't think there's an issue with that. I think what you were saying is very true, where it's like, hey, Charlize Theron, you saw how Rosamund Pike was just nominated for an Oscar in a Gillian Flynn movie. Do you want to do something similar? And she was like, hell yeah, I do. But yeah, I think every step of this movie was probably rushed to capitalize on the Gone Girl success.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know the production for this actually started before Gone Girl was released. Like, I think it's shot, in summer 2013, and Gone Girl released in 2014. So I don't necessarily think that it was 100% like, look what Gone Girl did. I think once Gone Girl came out, they were like, shit, we got to get this in theaters and capitalize, right? But I also think it might just be that, like, Gillian Flynn was a bit of an it girl for a couple years there. Like, they were like, this is the person. Like, we're gonna buy her books and we're gonna make them into movies. And that happens too. And I think that so it's probably at least partly that as well, where they were like, yeah, like, Fincher's making Gone Girl. Like, we don't know what Gone Girl is gonna look like, but Fincher's making it, so we got to capitalize on that. So I think it's all I'm saying is I think it's a little bit more complicated than just that, but it's definitely that too.
Yeah, that almost makes a bit more sense of why maybe someone like Paquet-Brenner, who I'm not disparaging him as a person whatsoever, but maybe that's why someone like him was able to be hired to direct this, where they were hoping that Gone Girl was going to be a success, and they knew David Fincher's track record, but they knew that they had to get someone quickly and to pump this movie out as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so that's why maybe he was, making the rounds, and it was like on the short list to direct a bunch of movies, and like, you know what, let's give this guy a chance and see what he does. Yeah,
I think that's probably pretty close to what, again, I have no inside knowledge of this, but that sounds like something that would happen for sure. And like I say, I don't think that they necessarily greenlit this movie knowing that Gone Girl was going to be a huge success, but I do think that once Gone Girl was a huge success, they were like, oh, okay, we got to get this out.
Yeah.
Because Gone Girl came out in, when did it come out? 2014, in the fall, I think.
It was September 2014.
Yeah, September 2014. And so, like, this was shot in 2013, and it was, it's not, again, you're not wrong. It's not unusual for a movie to take like 1 to 2 years to sort of get through the whole process. And so September 2013 would have been about a year after shooting this movie, and then it was out in April the following year. Like, it was just, they were like, oh shit, let's pick up the pace.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any last notes that you wanted to talk about this movie before we move on, or do you think we covered everything?
No, I think we covered it. I think it's honestly, I think it's great that you like. I think every movie needs to find its audience, so I think it's good. I think it's great that you liked it. I cannot in good conscience recommend it to anyone, but I am always on team see it for yourself. But it's honestly, it's just so boring. It's so freaking cool.
I will say this to wrap it up, to sort of why I liked it. I was intrigued enough by the mystery, and I think the crux of it for me liking it was they make a point. Charlize Theron makes a point several times to say, if you believe that my brother is innocent, why has he never filed for an appeal? And that was the one hook that kept me being like, okay, but why did he never do that? Why has he not tried to show remorse, or not remorse? Why has he tried to not be like, it wasn't me. I didn't kill the family. It wasn't me. Why did he never try to do that, especially to Libby? And that hook is what kept me going through this movie, where every time we would get a little bit more of a backstory, it got me more and more intrigued of how are they going to resolve that moment. And I think they did that in a satisfactory enough way where I enjoyed the movie enough to say, I liked it. I did not love this. I gave this movie a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd. It could very easily be a 3 or whatever, where it's just one of those movies where I'm like, this movie was enjoyable enough for what it was trying to be. It's not trying to be a grounded, realistic thriller. It's going to be a little bit over the top. And yes, at times that over the top is too much, but overall, I connect it with the story and appreciate it with what it was trying to do.
Yeah, that's fair. I didn't. So do with that information what you will, dear listener.
All right. Then let us move on to our next portion, which is going to be our double bill section. Now, I am making an executive decision now to remove the would you rather. In future episodes, I may bring it back, but as of right now, I am no longer going to be doing it just because I often find that it is very forced and that's not fun to do. And including my question that I came up with today, I thought was very forced and kind of dumb, so I don't want to do it anyways. So without further ado, we are just going to do our double bill pairing. So Matthew, what movie would you pair with Dark Places?
You should watch Gone Girl with Dark Places so that you can see a good version of what, because they're very similar in a lot of ways, right down to like unlikable female characters and voiceover narrations and vaguely non-linear-esque timelines. And it is, I think it'd be, especially if you've never seen either of them before, it would be very interesting to see both a not very good version of that and an excellent version of that back to back. And also just to remind yourself that, oh yeah, Gillian Flynn actually is a good writer. Like, I don't think that Dark Places being not great is her fault. I actually would, I haven't read it, but I would be shocked if the book wasn't super compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's something I want to ask you. I mentioned at the top of the show, they are remaking Dark Places into an HBO series. Do you think that if given more time and more chances to correct mistakes, that this could be a compelling TV show?
Oh, yeah. I think with just a little more thought put into how they want to execute, I think this could be a great TV show or movie. But I know they're doing a miniseries, I believe. And I look forward to seeing that because I think all the pieces are there for something great. And I think that, again, I haven't read it, but I would be shocked if the book wasn't very compelling. And I can't wait to see what they do with it.
Now, from what I gather, no casting has been announced as far as I could see, but they are shifting the structure a little bit in the sense of the Lyle character, which was played by Nicholas Hoult, is being replaced by a mother-daughter duo who approach Libby to investigate her former case.
Oh, interesting. I mean, sure.
Yeah.
That's more interesting than just... I say this as a person who really likes Nicholas Hoult. I only didn't bring him up in this because I don't think he was bad. I just thought it was another unremarkable part of this movie. But I think that's a way more interesting take. Like it's way more to mine out of that character being a mother and daughter than just being some guy who likes murders. There's way more there, way more potential there.
Yeah. The only thing I noted about Nicholas Hoult is the very first time we meet him, he's described as looking like a serial killer, and I couldn't help but laugh and be like, handsome nerdy Nicholas Hoult looks like a serial killer? In what world is that? I
mean, lots of worlds.
I mean, in reality, yes. In Hollywood world, no.
He's actually made a movie. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't very good. but he made a movie a couple years ago where he played a serial killer, and I can't remember what it's called now. He plays like an ad man or something. It also wasn't very memorable or very good, but he plays like an ad man or like a music. I think he's like a music promoter or something who like kills all of his he kills all his colleagues that turn out to be his competition. And that movie's not good, but it's not his fault.
I'll say this about your pick. I am not a huge Gone Girl fan. I like it enough, and I think everyone does a really good job in it, but I don't love it in the same way I love other David Fincher movies. I think it's kind of middle of the pack for him.
That's fair. I don't think it's his best movie. I just think it's a much better version of this kind of movie.
Yes.
And in fact, I actually toyed with the idea of my double bill being this movie and the Sharp Objects miniseries, which I think is a much better example, and especially because they're doing a miniseries of Dark Places. It's a very good example of a much more fleshed out world and characters and story in a way that I think is very satisfying.
Yeah. Okay. I haven't seen Sharp Objects, so I can't comment on that. I will go with my double bill.
Do you like Amy Adams, and do you like movies by Jean-Marc Vallée? Because that's what this is. It's so good.
I am mixed on Jean-Marc Vallée.
Oh, interesting. I think
he rest in peace.
If you liked his better stuff, then I think you would like. Did you watch Big Little Lies?
No.
Did you watch? I can't remember all his films off the top of my head. But if you like the stuff he's made with women in the lead, you will like Sharp Objects. And Amy Adams is always good.
My favorite Vallée movie is Crazy.
Oh yeah, that's fair. I think mine is. I think it's called Wild. It's the one where Reese Witherspoon walks the Pacific Coast Trail.
Yeah, that's probably my number 2.
Yeah, but I would say that Sharp Objects, which is a showcase for Amy Adams, but also for Patricia Clarkson, it's very, very good, and you should definitely watch it if you haven't. And granted, it'll be a different showrunner because rest in peace, Jean-Marc Vallée. But I think that this story, given the amount of time that Sharp Objects gives its story, could be great. And I look forward to finding out.
Fair. Okay. My pick for double bill pairing would be a documentary called Satan Wants You. Now, people probably don't know this movie very well, but it came out last year, and I interviewed the directors, Steve J. Adams and Sean Horler, for the podcast. And so I'm going to link to that in the show notes. It is a fascinating documentary talking about how the Satanic Panic was started in the early 1980s by a book that was published called Michelle Remembers. And basically, it was all made up bullshit. And this movie captures the insanity of how the cascading events from this book led to everything that the Satanic Panic eventually became, including several things that were depicted in Dark Place and stuff that you might look at and be like, this is ridiculous. No one would believe this ever happened. Satan Wants You shows actual, archival news footage and interviews with people that were involved at the time, and a whole bunch of other stuff that sort of put all that into context and show, no, this was unfortunately what was going on at this time. It's a fascinating, great documentary, and I think you can watch it if you're in Canada. Watch it for free on CBC Gem. I don't know where else it is streaming or available to watch. I think it's maybe on Tubi in the United States as well. But definitely worth checking out if you're curious at all about that era of history. And I think while it's sort of a bit of a minor part of the movie Dark Places, is a big enough part that I think it's a good double bill pairing.
I think it's a great choice, actually, and would also give you a much better understanding of the whole Satanic Panic thing, which I think is pretty glossed over in the movie we talked about. And also, it's worth noting Satan Wants You was one of our nominees for Best Cascadian Film in our film critics group.
Yes.
And also, for anyone who's local to, the Pacific Northwest, I grew up in a small town that was like the next town over from Victoria, BC, which is where all this happened. So, yeah, it was, I really connected with that film just for that reason, because like I grew up again like a stone throw from Victoria.
Well, good. I'm glad you approved my double bill pairing then.
Yeah, and as of right now, at least in Canada, it's available to rent on Apple TV or YouTube, but that seems to be it.
Okay, I think it briefly was on CBC Gem, so maybe it's not there anymore.
I mean, these things change all the time.
That's unfortunate. They do.
Actually, while you're talking, I'm just going to see if what the streaming situation is for the States. It just takes a minute to change the settings in this stupid app. When I say stupid app, I also mean amazing app, because it is Just Watch is great. Yeah, it's streaming for free on Tubi, and it is available to rent on Apple TV, Amazon, Fandango, and a bunch of other places.
Yeah, so definitely check out Satan Wants You if you've never heard of it or are interested in what we were talking about today, because it's a fantastic documentary and probably one of my favorite documentaries of the last few years.
Yeah, it is really good. I was really glad when we ended up nominating it for Best Cascadian Film. I really liked it.
Me too. Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Where can people find you, and what do you have going on in your life there?
So the easiest way to find me these days, honestly, is just to check out my homepage, which is stretched.ca. I link to all my recent work there, and it also links out to all of my socials, which I have a hard time listing, but I'm most active on Threads these days, and you can find me there at SmatthewAF. I'm also, of course, one half of the Awesome Friday podcast, which is generally a weekly show when there's not circumstances getting in the way. And this week we'll be talking about Abigail and the People's Joker, which I'm very excited about. And like I say, if you go to stretch.ca, you can see a lot of my recent writing, which has shifted more towards the television stuff lately for whatever reason. But I wrote about the new Apple TV show Dark Matter. I wrote about the new Doctor Who. I wrote about the new Star Wars project. I've written about, and then I wrote about the new Canadian film called The King Tide, which is great. And I have another review for a Canadian film coming up from the same director, interestingly enough, called Sweetland, which will be landing sometime in the next few days. So lots of writing going on lately.
Nice. Well, I've been covering hot docs along with a few other people. So if you go to ContraZoomPod.com, you're going to see a whole bunch of great hot docs reviews from Jeff Ballmer, who's written some stuff, Paulo Bautista, Brody Cottenham, all great writers who have been contributing to ContraZoomPod.com. And I'm about to embark on uncovering the Seattle International Film Festival, so there's going to be more reviews coming your way. And I really appreciate how people seem to be checking out the website and the reviews. I noticed that there's been a spike in clicks, so I really appreciate anyone that listens to the show and checks out the reviews that I either link to in the show notes or you're just checking the website. It really does mean a lot and helping us grow. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at ContraZoomPod. What are your thoughts on Dark Places, if you've even heard of that movie? Send an email to ContraZoomPod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.